Welcome, this is Dr. Michael Timms, and we're going to go over current practices and regulation of herbal medicine in the U.S. This will be a series of 3 lectures. We'll focus on the product market initially in the first 2, and then in the clinical setting in the third one. So let's just jump right into the first one. So what we'll cover is, 1, how do we define legal status of plants? And there are some different rules around this. We'll look at statutory authority and what does that actually mean, and then some product classification, consumer rights, and then we'll introduce the original DSHEA rulings that influence our product market right now. Part 2 will actually extend that DSHEA, talking to other regulatory bodies, and then part 3 we'll get into the clinical element. So first one is take a look at this and tell me which of these plants is illegal to sell. And take a minute and just look at it. Pause the video if you need to. See if you recognize the plants. So if you've paused it, given it some thought, top left, ayahuasca, top right, ephedra, and then the bottom, Salvia divinorum. So let's take a look at some of the laws affecting legality. So ayahuasca, the plants and preparations are legal since they don't contain DMT. This DMT, if you start to brew the ayahuasca with a DMT containing plant, then it's illegal because DMT is considered a Schedule I drug. But there are lots of challenges around this, similar to the use of peyote in the Native American church, to allow it to be legal for spiritual reasons. The salvia is not regulated under any Controlled Substance Act. However, on a state basis, Alabama, Delaware, Illinois, Louisiana, Michigan, Missouri, Ohio, Texas, and others have passed their own laws based on the use of the seed as a hallucinogen. So in the first 2, what we're really looking at are hallucinatory properties, and we know there are a number of plants that contribute to that capacity. The last one, mahuang or ephedra, was a wonderful TCM drug, or herb, I should say, that got turned into a drug-like substance based on both the powdering of it and mixing it with other compounds, particularly caffeine. And these were altered to serve the market in terms of weight control and performance. And there were several deaths associated with those mixtures, and the FDA ended up banning ephedra containing supplements in 2004. So originally, the supplement industry challenged, and it was overturned, but ultimately it was upheld. You really don't see this in the product market anymore. And really, the shame is that good cut and sift mahuang was wonderful as a treatment for congested lungs. This is something I've used on my children. Very safe. But once it got to be altered into powdered form and began to get mixed, it had some very strong effects on the cardiovascular system. But you can still dig this up in herb shops in Chinatowns in a number of cities. So let's look a little bit at the U.S. government regulation of botanical products. And they can be regulated out of a number of different departments. So you've got United States Department of Agriculture, obviously dealing with the growing of, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, tobacco products, Drug Enforcement, where you have use of herbals for hallucinatory properties, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. This is where we begin to either have introduced plants in the wild that are considered non-native, or oftentimes the illegal park farming that's happening in national parks. Actually, the U.S. and Wildlife gets involved. The Federal Trade Commission, and we'll get into that a little bit more on the Herbals and Food and Drug Administration. Same thing there, okay? So the regulation of claims, the FDA maintains primary authority of regulating disease claims made in any labeling and product literature. So this is true of, when we talk about labeling now, it's an expanded concept. It's not just the label on the product, but it's literally the information you pass out on your website, or if you have a book out where you have claims associated with your product in the book, and that can be linked back to the product, then these are all considered labels. So if there's an infraction here, if the FDA says you're not compliant, they'll ask you to change the label. And they can also assess punitive damages to those selling unapproved drugs. So Lane Labs actually had a $109 million suit against them. Now they had several warnings, and they chose not to comply with what the FDA was asking for. So this is where you see damages. You don't see them at the outset. You see them when a company challenges the rulings of the FDA. The Federal Trade Commission can maintain primary authority of regulating claims and advertisements. And those infractions, they get reviewed for any potential future marketing, and you can be fined. So this is where the initial step comes in, where there are claims. And we all know about structure function claims. So we know that you can't claim that echinacea will increase T cell counts or influence. You can't say that the use of echinacea will prohibit colds, but what you can say is that echinacea supports a healthy immune system. So this is some language elements that you need to be aware of. The Food and Drug Administration really was formed out of this Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1906. And so this is in the United States Code, Title 21. And this is where you get your statutory authority, the ability of an agency of the U.S. government to act based on underlying law. And this act regulated food, drugs, cosmetics, medical devices, and their manufacture. And really the focus of the Food and Drug Administration is really around making sure that the commerce of any food does not cause harm. So they're looking at safety. And manufacturers aren't actually required to prove safety. Based on certain categories, there's a presumption of safety. Now that'll be somewhat different as we get into what are called new dietary ingredients, where safety becomes a bigger issue, and that's a discussion for another time. But what the FDA does not regulate is any practice of medicine, and they actually don't regulate efficacy either, not in terms of herbs. So here's the statutory authority. These are a series of acts that were passed in Congress. So you can see the first one. That second one that's highlighted in 1994 is DSHEA, the Dietary Supplement and Health and Education Act. Post DSHEA, you have a Dietary Supplement and Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act, which was an act that actually protect access, farm security and rural investment, food allergen labeling, consumer protection, public health security, and bioterrorism preparedness. Note the date 2001 after 2002 after 9/11. And then finally this Food Safety Modernization Act, which really speaks to the production of herbals. So they actually classify then products that are either foods, they're dietary supplements, or they're drugs. And the regulations for each category are different, and they apply. So intended use is really the focal point, and that's decided on by the accompanying label claims, advertising material, oral or written statements. And that's why the claims become so important as a fulcrum, because what you claim then ends up designating which category you're going to find yourself in. So food is intended as an article of food consumed for flavor and nutritive value. And this is where we get our GRAS listing, are generally recognized as safe. There's no regulatory category now yet for functional foods, but this is something that's being looked at closely, and I imagine there are going to be more rules that come out around functional foods. Functional foods being foods that have been optimized with either herbs or additional nutrients that aren't part of the original food itself. A drug is an article intended for diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, and prevention of disease in man and animals. So it's intended to affect the structure or function of the body. It's listed in an official compendium, like the U.S. compendium, USP, and must be generally recognized as safe and effective, meaning there's pre-market approval. They actually have to go through a number of steps to show safety and that it works. Now, botanical products, this is different than herbal supplements. This is a category all by itself. This is if intended use is to cure, treat, and mitigate, they are drugs subject to current drug regulations. So botanicals have these unique qualities that are recognized by the FDA, that they're more complex than synthetic drugs. They're more likely to be components in those mixtures, a number of things, and the active constituents and activity are not always well defined. So if we look at some botanical products out there, there's actually a green tea extract called Varigan, which has been approved for use in genital warts. And so this is a product that is a botanical drug. It's treated as such. It can claim on its label that it treats genital warts. They've gone through clinical trials to prove it. They've gone through the clinical trials to prove not only efficacy but safety. There's also a crofelemer, which is an HIV-related diarrhea treatment. And this is from Crotican leclin, or what's called dragon's blood, the actual latex. So this is the exudate if you cut the bark of croton just under the bark surface, or the number of specialized cells that store latex. So this was originally actually developed and standardized by Shaman Pharmaceuticals. If you get a chance, go back and look at Shaman Pharmaceuticals. This was an attempt to really use herbal knowledge and indigenous knowledge to develop unique sort of herbal drugs that were more powerful but were still herbs. And they were well funded at first. They came out of San Francisco, but in the end they really they could make a go of it and they folded. But it's an interesting history nonetheless. So finally, as we get to the end of this segment, when DSHEA got started, there was really a huge outcry because there was an intention on the part of the FDA to do an awful lot more regulation. At that time, I had a health food store in Old Town Alexandria, and we were very much on the front lines of fighting back against the FDA, getting petitions, going up to Congress, testifying, being part of a general outcry that said, wait a moment, this is something that has been historically unregulated. Why are you all of a sudden trying to increase the regulation? An example of that is black currant oil was considered a food additive, or they wanted to. And when they brought that regulation, the courts actually overturned that. And this whole grassroots effort of consumers, manufacturers, practitioners really led to this whole Dietary Supplement Non-Prescription Drug Consumer Protection Act. And this changed DSHEA in such a way that it allowed a lot more autonomy in the parts of herbal product manufacturers, but it did set up some rulings. And we'll go over what DSHEA really defines and how the FDA is trying to maintain safety. So this is really the basis of it. It's a regulatory framework. It established labeling rules, and it created the Office of Dietary Supplements at the National Institutes of Health. So prior to DSHEA, many botanicals regulated as food, additives, or drugs, both requiring pre-market approval. Any product other than tobacco that contains a vitamin, mineral, herb, or other botanical amino acid is intended as a supplement to the diet. So a concentrate, a metabolite, a constituent, a combination of any of the above, they tended to want to treat as drugs. So let's leave the story there. Enjoy the rest of the work that you're doing, and look for this part 2, where we'll go over the paradigm, how this regulatory structure impacts us, both as users, consumers, and manufacturers. We'll look at the GMP, good manufacturing practices, and we'll look at how this whole DSHEA Act influences the production of herbal medicine. we'll get into the role of the FTC, and we'll look at some safety opportunities. Okay? Thank you.